Here is the thing they never tell you. For 60 years, Bilbo Baggins carried the most powerful object in the history of Middle-earth in his trouser pocket. He used it in goblin tunnels. He used it in the halls of the Elven King. He used it to vanish when the Sackville Bagginses came calling at Bag End, unannounced and unwelcome, their eyes already measuring the furniture. He kept it in a plain envelope on his mantelpiece for most of those 6 decades, occasionally taking it out to look at it, occasionally slipping it on just to feel the particular quality of not being there, the way a man might spin a coin simply to watch it spin. During all of that time, the Dark Lord of Mordor had absolutely no idea where it was. Not because he was not listening, not because the ring was shielded by some ancient protective enchantment, not because Gandalf had buried it under a ward, not because the Valar had mercifully clouded Sauron's vision. He had no idea because the hand holding the ring was not a hand his entire metaphysical architecture had been designed to detect. The hand was too small. The ambition behind it too quiet, the spiritual gravity too negligible, by every metric Sauron used to measure the worth of things, to register as meaningful. That is not an accident of the story. That is the story. What I am going to show you today is something embedded so deeply in the lore of Tolkien's legendarium that most fans, even dedicated ones, walk straight past it. The blindness of Sauron to Bilbo Baggins is not a convenient plot convenience that Tolkien hoped you would not examine too closely. It is the most devastating piece of structural irony in the entire history of Middle-earth. It is the moment where Tolkien encodes, with absolute precision, the fundamental limitation of evil, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. This is not speculation pulled from nowhere. This is what the text actually says when you follow it all the way down through the letters, through unfinished tales, through the appendices, through the Silmarillion's account of how Sauron was made, and what he built and what he became. Every piece of this connects. Here is the question that runs underneath everything we are about to explore. Did Sauron never sense Bilbo because he technically could not, because the ring's detection mechanism required more spiritual magnitude than a hobbit could provide? Or did he fail to sense him because something in the ring's design, something imprinted from Sauron's own nature and deepest assumptions about what matters in the world, made the very concept of a hobbit holding the ring literally unthinkable to the mind that forged it? Hold that. We will return to it. Each time we do, it will be heavier. Let us start with what the One Ring actually is, because the films got this wrong in a specific way that matters enormously for what we are building here. The film version of the ring is, primarily, a tracking device, a lure, something that calls to the greedy and the weak and draws them toward Mordor, and simultaneously broadcasts their location to the eye that made it. And yes, it does those things. But Tolkien's description of the ring in his letters goes much further, and the distinction between the film version and the lore version is critical. In Letter 131, written in 1951 as a summary of the mythology for a potential publisher, Tolkien describes the One Ring as an instrument of domination, not a weapon in the sense of a sword or a plague, an instrument engineered with extraordinary craftsmanship and intention to reach into the minds of beings who already possess great will, great ambition, great hunger for power, and to turn that existing force back toward Sauron. The ring works by amplification. It finds what is already there in the bearer and magnifies it. This is not a subtle distinction. It is the architectural foundation of the entire ring mythology, and everything that follows depends on understanding it. Think about what amplification means as a design principle. An amplifier requires a signal. It cannot create sound from silence. It takes what is already present and makes it louder, stronger, larger. A microphone in an empty room picks up nothing and amplifies nothing. The same microphone held against a beating heart amplifies the rhythm of something already alive. Take the microphone away from the heart, and the heart still beats, but the amplifier has nothing to work with. The ring works exactly this way. It finds what is already in the bearer and turns it upward until the bearer can no longer tell where they end, and the ring's will begins. Galadriel refuses the ring in the Fellowship of the Ring, and what she says in that moment is worth reading very carefully. She does not say she is afraid of losing control in some vague, generic way. She says she has been tempted for a long time. She says the possibility of the ring coming to her has lived in her mind. She says she has thought about what she would do if it appeared before her, that she has been doing the internal work of deciding across the full length of the Third Age. Her refusal is not improvised in the moment. It is the culmination of a deliberate process of self-examination conducted across 3,000 years, because she understood, from the moment the rings were forged, that her greatness was the ring's opening, not her weakness, her greatness. Think about that. She is not afraid of her darkness. She is afraid of what the ring would do with her light. It would take her genuine desire to heal and restore Middle-earth, her real love for the world and its people, and through amplification, it would metastasize that love into something unrecognizable, something that dressed tyranny in the language of care. She knows exactly what she would become, and she has spent 3,000 years building the internal strength to refuse it. Now think about what the ring finds when it comes to Bilbo Baggins. Not the movie Bilbo, the lore Bilbo. In Concerning Hobbits, the prologue Tolkien wrote to The Lord of the Rings, hobbits are described with considerable specificity. They have no magic, in any sense the word usually carries. They have no ancient lineage connected to the powers of the world. They have no rings of their own, no great warcraft, no political ambitions that extend meaningfully beyond the borders of the Shire. They are, in Tolkien's own word in Letter 131, an unhistoric people. That word is exact and important. Hobbits are outside the currents of history, not merely peripheral to them. They are a people the great powers of Middle-earth have never found it necessary to include in their calculations of who matters. The ring was designed to amplify the qualities that drive historical actors. Ambition, will toward power, grief turned to conquest, pride that cannot accept its own limits, the longing for a greatness commensurate with one's self-estimation. These are the qualities of kings and wizards and mighty captains. These are the qualities that built Númenor and raised the towers of Minas Anor and drove the armies of the Last Alliance across Dagorlad. These are not the qualities of a hobbit who is primarily interested in his garden and his larder and his afternoon tea. And here is the question that follows. What does an amplifier do with silence? What does an instrument of domination do with a creature who desires nothing worth dominating toward? It does almost nothing. It waits. It nudges gently. It gives its bearer a longer life than nature intended, and a gradually increasing reluctance to part with it, a mild possessiveness that emerges over years, rather than exploding into corruption the way it would in a man or an elf of great ambition. That is the most the ring could manage with Bilbo in 60 years, a possessiveness that worried Gandalf when he came to look, an envelope on a mantelpiece. 6 decades, and the ring's grip on Bilbo amounted to minor hoarding behavior and an occasional tendency to disappear from visitors he preferred not to see. This is not incidental to the story. This is the ring's fundamental limitation exposed by the most ordinary creature in Middle-earth, in the most ordinary possible setting. Now hold that understanding against the specific historical moment when Bilbo found the ring, because the timing is not accidental, and it matters for the argument in ways that casual reading misses entirely. Third Age 2941. Bilbo Baggins, separated from the dwarves he has been hired to assist, alone in a darkness he has never encountered before, finds a golden ring on the floor of a goblin tunnel, deep beneath the misty mountains. In that same year. Third Age 2941. The White Council drives Sauron from Dol Guldur, not destroys him, drives him out. Sauron flees east, across the Great River, and begins the long work of reconstituting himself in Mordor. The White Council had known something dark was building in Dol Guldur for decades. Saruman had argued against intervention. Gandalf had pressed for action. Galadriel had finally insisted, and the Council had moved. What they found and expelled from Dol Guldur was not the full Sauron. It was a diminished, half-constituted shadow of him, something powerful enough to fill the forest with dread and corrupt the woodland realm, but not powerful enough to reclaim the armies of the last age or declare himself openly as the enemy he truly was. Unfinished Tales makes this clear in its account of the Second Age and early Third Age. Sauron had been operating under deliberate concealment, building slowly, unwilling to show his full hand until he was strong enough to hold it. The White Council's action in 2941 set him back considerably. He departed in a manner that might seem to indicate defeat, Tolkien tells us. And indeed, it was defeat. Temporary, but real. He moved east to finish what he had been building for a very long time. Now here is what this means for the ring. For the first 20 years that Bilbo had the ring in the Shire, Sauron was actively reconstituting himself in Mordor, not looking for the ring with any great intensity. From his perspective, the ring had been lost at the Gladden Fields when it slid from Isildur's finger 5 centuries before, and it had made no detectable signal in the intervening time. He was rebuilding his fortress, rebuilding his armies, rebuilding the physical presence that the last alliance had unmade at the end of the Second Age. He did not openly declare himself as the Dark Lord, openly reveal his survival and his intent, until Third Age 2951, a full decade after Bilbo's adventure under the Misty Mountains. So during the earliest and most critical years of Bilbo's tenure with the ring, Sauron was too diminished and too focused on reconstitution to be actively searching for anything at great distance. And by the time he was strong enough to begin taking the ring's absence seriously as a strategic concern, the ring had been sitting in the Shire for a decade, unremarkable, undetected, used to escape bothersome cousins and little else. This convergence of timing is extraordinary in its implications. The ring found Bilbo in the exact year that Sauron was at his weakest and most distracted. It then spent the years of Sauron's gradual rebuilding in the possession of someone who generated no spiritual signal of the magnitude required to attract attention. By the time Sauron was strong enough to actively seek the ring with full intensity, Bilbo had passed it to Frodo, and Frodo had carried it quietly in the Shire for 17 years before any of the events of The Lord of the Rings begin. 77 years in the hands of hobbits. Sauron rebuilding and recalculating across that entire span. The ring sitting in a hole in the ground as though it had never been forged. But the timing, however extraordinary, is not the deepest explanation. Even if Sauron had been at full strength from the moment Bilbo found the ring, even if the White Council had never driven him east in that critical year, there is a structural reason he could not have sensed the ring in Bilbo's possession. And that reason lives in the nature of hobbits themselves, in what they are metaphysically, rather than physically. Tolkien builds hobbits carefully, and the building has philosophical purpose that goes beyond narrative convenience. In Concerning Hobbits, he describes them as having an extraordinary ability to escape notice, to move quietly through the world, to blend with their surroundings in a way that creatures of greater presence never manage. This is usually read as a physical quality, the light step and soft voice, and ability to vanish into hedgerows. But Tolkien intends something deeper than physical stealth. In Letter 131, he describes hobbits as significant to the story, not because of any power they possess, but because of what they do not possess. They are outside the currents of power that define the Third Age. No rings of power, no great lineage connected to the Valar or the Maiar. No place in the great stories that the powerful tell about themselves. And this outsideness, this position entirely beyond the reach of Middle-earth's metaphysical machinery, is precisely what makes them capable of something no powerful being can manage, carrying the ring toward destruction without becoming its instrument. The ring reaches for power. Hobbits have none. Not in any form the ring was built to recognize. Here is where the Nazgoul complicate the argument, because they suggest a detection mechanism that does not require great spiritual magnitude. At Weathertop, Frodo wearing the ring is intensely visible to the ringwraiths. They sense him with terrible clarity. In the wraith realm he partially enters. In the Shire, a black rider pauses outside Bag End and inhales, as though tasting the air for something it almost recognizes. These moments seem to challenge what we have been building. If the Nazgoul can sense ring-bearers, why didn't one of them sense Bilbo at some point during 60 years of regular use? The answer lies in the precise mechanics of how Nazgoul detection works, and how it differs from Sauron's detection. The Nazgoul are themselves ring-bearers. They once wore the 9 rings given to mortal men, and through those rings they were drawn into the wraith world they now permanently inhabit. Their connection to the one ring is resonant in the way a tuning fork is resonant with a matching note, something almost biological, rooted in what they have become rather than in deliberate active searching. When a ring-bearer enters the wraith realm by wearing the one ring, the Nazgoul feel it the way you might feel a vibration in a string you are already touching. Not through active effort, through shared frequency. But this resonance has significant limits. It requires proximity. It requires the ring-bearer to be generating spiritual disturbance detectable at the relevant distance. Frodo at Weathertop. Frodo at the Ford of Bruinen. Frodo moving inexorably toward Mordor with the full weight of the quest pressing on him. Frodo generates disturbance. Not because he is spiritually great in the way that Galadriel or Gandalf is great, but because the ring grows more active and more straining as it approaches the place of its making, because the circumstances of the quest are themselves pressing on the ring with a force the ring cannot ignore. Bilbo in the Shire in 2942, using the ring to slip past his cousins, is not generating that disturbance. He is far from Mordor. He is not moving toward it. He is not a being of spiritual magnitude whose presence in the Wraith realm would echo outward across hundreds of miles to where a Nazgul might catch the echo. And Sauron's detection is different in kind from the Nazgul's resonance. He poured himself into the ring. He is the ring's maker. But for exactly that reason, his connection to it is not a radar sense picking up its location through space. It is the awareness of its absence felt as an ongoing wound, a diminishment, a deprivation that never fully heals. He knows the ring exists. He does not feel its exact whereabouts through any supernatural sense. He feels that it is not with him. The distinction is critical. He was told where it was, eventually. Not by any magical perception breaking through, by Gollum's broken voice under torment, naming 2 words, Baggins, Shire. Here is the timeline from Unfinished Tales, the essay, The Hunt for the Ring, and it is exact and damning. Third Age, 3017. More than 75 years after Bilbo's adventure, Sauron's servants capture Gollum. Not through any detection of the ring's location, through patient, conventional intelligence work, tracking a creature who had been wandering the dark places of the world for decades, making noise, leaving traces, drawing attention through the sheer intensity of his obsession and grief. Gollum had been searching desperately for the ring since Bilbo won it from him in their riddling contest. He had traveled through the Misty Mountains, south through Mordor, into Harad, back north, eventually into Mirkwood where Aragorn would one day find and hold him, long before Sauron's servants arrived. Sauron's people followed the sound of Gollum's desperation, not the ring's signal, the noise of one broken creature's unbearable loss. They bring Gollum before the Dark Lord, or to those who question in his name, and under duress, Gollum names 2 words, Baggins, Shire. That is the sum of what Sauron learns, not coordinates, not a magical fix on the ring's location. 2 words from a creature in agony, words that mean almost nothing to Sauron, because the Shire is not a place that features in any serious calculation of power in Middle-earth. The Shire is a farming community far to the northwest, beyond the sphere of any real military or political significance. The idea that the One Ring has been there for 77 years is not just improbable from Sauron's perspective. It is barely conceivable. Picture this. Somewhere in Sauron's rebuilt network of intelligence and interrogation, the most powerful being in Middle-earth receives a report that finally tells him where his greatest creation has been hiding. And what he is told is this: a creature called Baggins, a place called the Shire. He does not know the Shire. He has to find it on a map, and what he finds there is nothing. Fields, farms, pipeweed, a people so thoroughly removed from the currents of history that his intelligence apparatus has no detailed information about them at all, no reason ever to have gathered any. His Nazgoul must search for a name in a population that his vast resources have never found it necessary to document. The most powerful military apparatus in the history of Middle-earth has to go door to door, and it nearly gets there in time. But not quite. Not quite. Because 77 years of invisibility had given the other side a head start that even the Nazgoul could not fully close. Now let us name the flaw at the root of all of this. Because that is what this has been building toward, and naming it fully is the thing that changes how you read the whole legendarium. Sauron did not make a mistake when he designed the ring. He made a masterpiece. In Letter 131, Tolkien says that in making the ring, Sauron let a great part of his own former power pass into it. The ring is, in the most literal sense, a piece of Sauron, an expression of his will, his intelligence, his understanding of how power works in the world. And his understanding of how power works in the world is precisely that it flows through beings of great will and ambition, through kings who want dominion, through wizards who want wisdom so complete it becomes its own kind of control, through warriors who want victory so badly they will pay any price for it. These are the creatures that interest him. These are the creatures his ring was built to capture. He built the ring in his own image, which means the ring can only see what Sauron can see, and reach for what Sauron can reach for, and detect what Sauron can imagine is worth detecting. Here is what the Silmarillion tells us about the nature of evil in Tolkien's cosmology. Melkor, the first Dark Lord and Sauron's master, is described in the Ainul Indale as a power who cannot create. He can only distort and corrupt what others have made. Every dark thing in Middle-earth is a perversion of something original and good. Orcs are corrupted elves. Trolls are corrupted beasts. Dragons are distorted and magnified instances of base appetite. Sauron himself was once Mairon, one of the greatest craftsmen among the Maiar, a being of extraordinary skill in service of Aule the Smith, who chose to follow Melkor and pour his genius into domination rather than making. Evil in Tolkien's world is always parasitic on existing good. It requires something to latch onto. It requires an existing quality to amplify and twist. It cannot corrupt from nothing. It cannot create corruption in a vacuum. It needs material. And hobbits provide almost no material. Their deepest traits are a love of comfort, a love of routine, a resistance to change that occasionally curdles into small-mindedness, and a capacity for possessiveness over things they have decided belong to them. Under the specific conditions of Saruman's occupation of the Shire, in The Return of the King, hobbits can become petty enforcers of small-scale tyranny, informers, collaborators, people who are suddenly very interested in rules, when the rules give them a little power over their neighbors. This is real corruption. This is what hobbits look like when evil actually gets purchase. But notice the scale of it. The corruption of hobbits, at its worst, produces Lotho Sackville Baggins and some bullying ruffians. Not a Nazgoul, not a Boromir pushed to attempted theft by the amplification of real love for his people and real terror for his city, twisted beyond recognition. Not a Saruman who started wanting wisdom and ended wanting control of everything. The ring in Bilbo's hands, over 60 years, produced a slightly possessive relationship with a piece of jewelry and a tendency to call it "my precious" on a few occasions, that Gandalf noted with quiet alarm. 60 years, and that is the sum of what the ring managed. Because there was nothing in Bilbo for the ring to build from, nothing its mechanism could amplify into something that served Sauron's purposes. The ring reached into Bilbo and found contentment, affection for his home and his comforts, genuine curiosity about the wider world, mild vanity about his reputation as an adventurer, and a deep love of his own armchair. None of that makes a Dark Lord. None of that makes even a complicated hobbit. The ring was too perfectly designed. That is the architectural flaw, and it is the core of what we are here to understand. An instrument of domination so precisely calibrated to exploit greatness that it was constitutionally incapable of registering ordinariness. And ordinariness, walking quietly through the margins of the world while the powerful consumed each other, was the thing that would ultimately destroy it. Here is where it gets beautiful and terrible at once, if you are willing to hold both at the same time. The ring has will. This is not a metaphor. Tolkien is explicit about this across several texts. The ring desires to return to Sauron. It has something like intention, something like cunning, imprinted from the nature of the being who forged it. When the ring slipped off Isildur's finger at the Gladden Fields in Third Age 2, Tolkien describes the event in Unfinished Tales as an act of will. The ring abandoned Isildur in the moment of his death by drowning, chose to fall from his finger into the river rather than remain on a hand moving away from Mordor. It saw a stronger master approaching, in some sense, or simply calculated that the river gave it better odds of eventually finding the way home than a dead man's hand. This is a ring with genuine agency, a ring that makes choices toward specific ends. And yet for 60 years in the Shire, the ring's desire produced almost nothing of consequence. It could not move Bilbo toward Mordor. It could not steer him toward significant power, toward the kind of bearer who might carry it closer to its master. It could not engineer a situation that would put it in the hands of someone more useful to it, because Bilbo's lack of ambition gave it no lever to work with. The ring could not promise Bilbo dominion, because Bilbo did not want dominion. It could not promise him revenge because he held no ancient grievances worth nursing into conquest. It could not offer him the thing he most wanted because what he most wanted was a second breakfast and a comfortable evening at home, and those things required no ring. Picture this: the mantelpiece at Bag End. A small golden ring resting in a plain envelope, perhaps slightly dusty at the edges. Unremarkable to anyone who does not know what it is, and barely remarkable even to the Hobbit who does know, except in the way of a useful key that he thinks of sometimes, and forgets about for months at a time. The fire is burning low in the Hobbit hole. The Shire is quiet outside. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the borders of that quiet world, Sauron is rebuilding. Armies are forming. Plans are being made. And on a mantelpiece in a hole in the ground, the most powerful object in the history of Middle-earth is waiting in an envelope. Patient and purposeful, and entirely incapable of doing anything at all with the creature it has found itself bonded to. The ring spent 60 years in the hands of someone it could not use, trying to find a way towards someone it could use, generating nothing that Sauron could hear. Not because the ring was weak, because the bearer was too ordinary for the ring's mechanism to produce a signal worth detecting. Now consider what this means for the concept of detection. Sauron built the ring as an extension of himself. It shares his assumptions about the world. It shares his blindness to everything outside those assumptions, and his blindness, encoded in the ring's very nature, meant that the ring in Hobbit hands was not just quiet. It was, in Sauron's cosmological imagination, essentially impossible. Go back to the Ainulindal. At the beginning of everything, before the world was made, Ilúvatar proposes a theme to the Ainur, the holy ones who were his thought made into being, and they play it together in a great music. And Melkor, the greatest of the Ainur, begins to weave his own contrary theme into the music, dissonant, powerful, intended to drown out or distort or usurp the harmony Ilúvatar established. He tries to impose his own vision over the shared one, and Ilúvatar does not suppress Melkor's discord. He incorporates it. He lifts the music to a new level that encompasses the discord, weaves it into something more complex and more beautiful than anything that could have existed without the disruption. Melkor cannot hear this happening. He is too deep in his own theme, too convinced that his disruption is winning, to perceive the way Ilúvatar is using his rebellion to build something Melkor never intended. Sauron played the same theme in smaller key. He built his domination around the absolute certainty that power is the only thing that matters, that greatness is the only thing that defines significance, that the world's meaningful actors are always those with the will to reshape it according to their ambitions. He designed his ring accordingly. It was a masterwork precisely because it expressed his vision of the world with extraordinary precision and craft. And in being so precisely calibrated to his vision, it was completely blind to everything outside it. Evil, in Tolkien's world, cannot imagine what it has no framework for imagining. It cannot conceive of the threat it cannot model. It cannot hear the counter-melody it has never thought to listen for. Sauron could control powerful minds. He could corrupt great hearts. He could promise power and deliver it, at terrible cost, until the corruption consumed everything the bearer once was. But he could not control someone who wanted nothing he was offering. He could not threaten someone with the loss of power they never desired in the first place. He could not seduce someone with grandeur they had no capacity to imagine themselves inhabiting. The ring was built on the assumption that every meaningful creature in the world wanted, at its core, what Sauron wanted. And that assumption, encoded into the ring's detection mechanism, into its amplification architecture, into the very grain of its purpose, was wrong about the most important creatures in the story. Hobbits do not want what Sauron has to offer. They do not want dominion or power, or the kind of greatness that requires armies and the ruin of other people's peace. They want second breakfast. They want their gardens. They want to visit their cousins and come home and find everything where they left it. And that want, that completely unambitious, entirely modest, almost embarrassing want, was the one thing Sauron's entire architecture of domination could not reach. Picture this, somewhere in the rebuilt towers of Barad-dûr, in the dark heart of Mordor where the eye turns ceaselessly, scanning the horizons of Middle-earth for threats worth considering, Sauron is listening. With everything he has, with the full force of a will that spans ages and cannot be destroyed. He is listening for the ring, and the ring is on a mantelpiece in the Shire. He cannot hear it, not because his hearing is faulty, not because some protection has been laid over Bilbo's home, but because the frequency on which the ring is broadcasting, in the hands of a small creature with no spiritual magnitude and no ambition beyond his own front door, is a frequency outside the range of everything Sauron built himself to detect. He was listening for trumpets, for the roar of power on the move. What the ring was doing in the Shire was not a trumpet. It was barely a whisper. It was silence, from Sauron's perspective, the perfect, comfortable silence of a world containing nothing worth watching. That is the dark truth. And here is the question, in its deepest form, now that we have built everything necessary to hear it properly. Not the version from the cold open, where it was still a puzzle about detection mechanics. This version, the one it has been building toward across everything we have covered. Did Sauron fail to sense Bilbo because he technically could not, because the ring's amplification mechanism required more spiritual magnitude than a hobbit possesses? Or did he fail to sense Bilbo because the ring itself, shaped in the image of Sauron's assumptions about what has worth and significance in the world, made hobbits so comprehensively outside his model of reality that they were not just undetected, but literally unthinkable as a threat? Maybe the answer is both. Maybe the technical limitation and the philosophical limitation are the same incapacity expressed at two different levels. The ring cannot detect through a hobbit because it was not designed to detect through a hobbit. It was not designed to detect through a hobbit because Sauron, in designing it, could not conceive of a hobbit as something the ring would ever need to account for. The technical failure is the philosophical failure, made material. His blindness is the ring's blindness. His assumptions are the ring's assumptions. What he could not imagine, the ring could not see. He did not fail to sense Bilbo, despite his intelligence. He failed to sense Bilbo because of it, because his intelligence was so perfectly calibrated to the world as power organizes it, that it had no receiver for the world as ordinary life organizes it. He had made himself into a precision instrument, tuned to a very narrow band, and the narrow band excluded everything that ultimately mattered. What this means for the fate of Middle-earth is something that does not reduce to a single sentence, and should not try to. The Fellowship had a chance not because it was strong enough to defeat Sauron in any direct confrontation. No military alliance of the Third Age could have defeated Sauron at full strength, with the armies he was assembling and the will that drives them. The War of the Ring was, on conventional military terms, lost before it began. The West was buying time. throwing everything it had into a desperate action to keep Sauron's gaze divided while the ring moved quietly toward the fire. The chance existed only because Sauron could not see the ring coming in time to redirect his attention from the armies at his gates to the two small figures crawling through the ash fields of Gorgoroth with the weight of the world between them. He was watching the horizon for the enemy he had built his entire strategy around defeating. He was calculating against kings and wizards and the soldiers of Gondor and Rohan. He was magnificently, devastatingly prepared for the threat he could imagine. He could not imagine Frodo Baggins. He could not have imagined Bilbo Baggins, 60 years before, picking up the ring in the dark. Sauron built the most powerful instrument of domination in the history of Middle-earth, and in doing so he encoded his own deepest blindness into it. He made a weapon so precisely calibrated to exploit greatness that it could not register ordinariness. And ordinariness, carrying that weapon quietly through the margins of the world, unmade him. There is something in that which goes beyond Tolkien, something true and cold and worth sitting with longer than one watch or one read allows. Strength that cannot imagine weakness, cannot protect against it. Power that cannot conceive of the powerless, cannot account for what the powerless might do. A mind that defines the world's meaningful population entirely by their connection to dominion will always leave out the creature that desires no dominion at all. And that creature, walking quietly in the places that power never bothers to look, was already on its way. From the Ainulindal, the creation myth at the heart of the Silmarillion, there is a principle running through Tolkien's entire mythology, that evil, however vast, sings only its own theme. Melkor disrupted the music with his own contrary noise, and could not hear the theme of Ilúvatar, incorporating his disruptions into something more complex and more beautiful than any single voice could have built. He was too deep in his own sound to hear the counter-melody he was inadvertently making possible. Sauron played the same theme in smaller key, building his domination, calibrating his detection, listening for what his design told him to listen for. And underneath all of that noise, for 60 years, a small creature in a hole in the ground was keeping his ring in an envelope on the mantelpiece, invisible, undetected, not because the world had hidden it from Sauron, because Sauron had built himself into something that could not hear it. This was always going to be how it ended, not because of fate, not exactly, but because of what Sauron was, what he had made himself, what he could and could not see. The destruction of the ring was built into the forging of the ring, folded into the same act, inseparable from it. When Sauron poured his power and his vision and his deepest assumptions about the world into that golden band in the fires of Orodruin, he was also pouring in his blindness. And blindness, in Tolkien's world, is always the thing that undoes the powerful. He did not lose because he was beaten. He lost because he could not see the hand that beat him. Now that you have all of this, go back to the scene where Bilbo finds the ring in the dark tunnel. Watch the ease of it, the accident. A creature bending down in a darkness so complete it has texture, finding something on the floor by touch, deciding to pocket it without knowing what it is. The most casual discovery in the history of Middle-earth. No fanfare, no sense of significance. Just a small pair of hands in the dark, and something waiting there to be found. That moment undid an age, because the hands were the wrong hands for everything Sauron had built to detect. And that wrongness was not an accident of fortune. It was the logical conclusion of a Dark Lord who built his instruments of detection around the only kind of threat he could conceive of, and left unguarded against everything he could not. If that changes how you read this world, if it changes what you hear when Gandalf says the ring passed to Bilbo and something more than luck was at work, tell me what you think is actually at work, because I do not believe the text gives a clean answer. I believe Tolkien left the question open deliberately, because it is the kind of question that does not resolve cleanly and should not. Was it chance? Was it design from a level above Sauron's comprehension? Was it simply the inherent limitation of evil expressing itself in the most consequential possible moment? Drop your answer below. The conversation that follows from this question is worth having. There is more in this legendarium, deeper than most people ever go. If you want to keep going, subscribe. We are just getting started.